Welcome along, fellow time travelers and strange historians. This time around, we're going to travel back in time to check out the final hours and terrifying moments of Buddy Holly's life. You're going to see some really interesting snaps, some of which you may have never seen before. Before I begin, please like and share the show, and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Now please join me around the campfire.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin. 3 young singers who soared to the heights of show business on the current rock and roll craze were killed today in the crash of a light plane in an Iowa snow flurry. The singers were identified as Ritchie Valens, 17, Buddy Holly, 22, and J.P. Richardson, known professionally as the Big Bopper.
On February 3rd, 1959, the great musical genius Buddy Holly, along with fellow musicians Ritchie Valens and J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, died in a tragic plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa. At the time, they were on the Winter Dance Party tour, zigzagging across the Midwest. During that harsh winter, the musicians endured extreme cold while traveling in a series of cramped and drafty old buses, which had the unfortunate tendency to break down. The grueling and uncomfortable long journeys between venues in bitterly cold conditions had taken a toll on the performers, resulting in cases of illness and even frostbite. The tour kicked off with a January 23rd performance in Milwaukee, where they faced frigid temperatures of 17 degrees below zero, playing to a crowd of 6,000. From there, the tour zigzagged through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, with the bands performing nightly and often covering long distances of 300 or 400 miles to reach small towns. After about a week, their spirits had dampened. Ritchie Valens fell ill, and the Big Bopper was coming down with the flu, and the lack of time for laundry added to their discomfort. Besides the cold, an unpleasant odor began to emanate from the buses. As Waylon Jennings would later recall, quote, "We smelled like goats," end quote. And so on January 30th, Buddy Holly inquired with one of the promoters about chartering a plane for he and his band for the next leg of their journey to Moorhead, Minnesota. The manager of the venue, Carol Anderson, arranged for the charter of an aircraft through Dwyer Flying Service in Mason City, Iowa, to Hector Airport in Fargo, North Dakota, which was the closest one to Moorhead. For the flight aboard the 1947 single-engined V-tail Beechcraft 35 Bonanza, the flying service charged a fee of $36 per passenger. This particular aircraft could accommodate 3 passengers alongside the pilot. As of the date of this recording, this fee would be the equivalent to approximately $500 per passenger. Feeling that he was stricken with the flu, the Big Bopper begged Waylon Jennings to let him have his seat on the plane, and Waylon Jennings agreed. Because Ritchie Valens also wanted to get on the flight, he had a coin toss with Tommy Alsop, and Ritchie Valens won. And so after the conclusion of the show at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, Mr. Anderson drove Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper to the nearby airport. The elevation of the airport stood at 1,214 feet above sea level. The weather conditions at the time of their departure were reported as light snow, with a cloud ceiling at 3,000 feet above sea level. Obscured sky, visibility extending to 6 miles. The winds were ranging from 20 to 30 miles per hour. Over the preceding 8 hours, the pilot had reached out to the Air Traffic Communication Service on 3 different occasions to obtain weather updates for his intended flight path. Each time he received information indicating that the weather conditions were visual flight rules, with cloud cover at or above 4,200 feet and visibility extending to 10 miles or more. However, the Air Traffic Communication Service did not relay to Peterson a flash advisory, alerting him to a significant weather event. This advisory warned of a 100-mile-wide swath of snow advancing into the area at a rate of 25 knots. These adverse conditions included the presence of moderate to heavy icing and winds blowing at speeds of 30 to 50 knots, equivalent to 15 to 26 feet per second. At 12:15 a.m., Mr. Anderson and the musicians arrived at the airport. They were met by their assigned pilot, Roger Arthur Peterson. He was 21 years old. He had amassed a total of 711 flight hours, with 128 hours specifically on Bonanza aircraft. Peterson had also completed 52 hours of instrument flight training, although he had only passed the written examination and was not yet qualified to fly in conditions that necessitated reliance solely on instruments. Both Peterson and Dwyer Flying Service were certified to operate exclusively under visual flight rules, which mandated that the pilot must have a clear line of sight to navigate the aircraft effectively. It's been said that the pilot sometimes suffered in-flight vertigo and disorientation. It was later found out that during a March 1958 training flight, the pilot had been, quote, very susceptible to distractions, end quote. On the night of the accident, conducting a visual flight would have been exceedingly challenging due to the presence of low clouds, the absence of a discernible horizon, and the lack of ground lights in the sparsely populated area. The musicians boarded the chartered plane. Buddy Holly sat in the front, next to the pilot. At 12:40 a.m., the aircraft started to taxi toward runway 17. During this time, the pilot contacted ATCS once more to request the latest weather update. The updated report indicated the following conditions. The cloud cover had lowered to 3,000 feet. The sky was obscured. Visibility was reduced to 6 miles due to light snow, and there were gusty winds ranging from 20 to 30 knots. The tower operator asked the pilot for his flight plan. The pilot replied that he would give it once he was airborne. The aircraft took off normally from runway 17 at 12:55 a.m. Central Standard Time on Tuesday, February 3rd. Hubert Jerry Dwyer, the owner of the flying service, observed the southbound takeoff from a platform outside the control tower. He maintained a clear view of the aircraft's tail light for most of the brief flight, which commenced with an initial 180-degree left turn, passing east of the airport and ascending to approximately 800 feet above ground level. After making an additional left turn to a northwesterly heading, the taillight gradually descended until it vanished from sight. Mr. Dwyer thought it looked like the taillight had gone down, but was assured it was just an optical illusion. And so think about this. The pilot couldn't see the moon. The pilot couldn't see the stars. The pilot couldn't see lights on the ground. Remember, this is 1959, in an area surrounded by farms in Iowa. The pilot was flying in total darkness, where he couldn't discern any visual references to gauge the airplane's orientation. Because he was not familiar with some of the vital equipment, the pilot was confused. He swiftly experienced spatial disorientation and likely realized he had no control over the Bonanza. Amid the pitch-dark northern plains, shrouded by an overcast sky, concealing the stars above, and void of city lights below, he found himself disoriented, unable to discern which way was up. At that point, the pilot and his passengers were doomed. But did the pilot stay silent, or did he tell the passengers? We know that the Big Bopper was sick. Maybe he was too sick to even think straight, and he had his eyes closed trying to get some rest. Maybe they were all exhausted, and they were all seated with their eyes closed. Or perhaps they were all wired after having performed a concert. Or perhaps they were excited about being on the plane. Or maybe they were scared about being in this small plane at night in total darkness, heading into an approaching storm. What sort of conversations do you think took place at that time if they knew they were doomed? What sort of conversations do you think took place if they did not know they were doomed? What do you think was going on in the aircraft at that time? Because whatever it was, it didn't last long. You see, 3 or 4 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft's starboard wingtip struck the frozen ground, creating a deep 12 by 2 furrow. The wing then crumbled and broke off. This initiated a high-speed cartwheel at a velocity of about 170 miles per hour. The fuselage then bounced a short distance into the air and traveled another 50 feet. The momentum of the heavy engine caused the fuselage, with the left wing still attached and intact, to roll upon itself into a near ball shape, rolling nose over tail, nose over tail, nose over tail, across the frozen field. When the cabin ruptured, the now unfastened passengers were ejected and hurled out of the aircraft and along the ground in a northwesterly direction for 540 feet, along with many components of the aircraft. The plane made its final impact with the ground in an inverted, nose-down orientation, with the nose striking and flipping the plane over into a right-side-up, tail-first position. The aircraft then came to a rest against the northern perimeter fence of a long, empty cornfield. The aircraft was banked 90 degrees to the right in a nose-down attitude. Can you imagine being in that aircraft when all this happened? What was the reaction of the pilot and passengers when the plane's wing hit the ground and the plane tumbled and flew about 50 feet in the air upside down and tumbled like a ball? Could they scream? Could they even think? Were the passengers still alive when they were thrown from the aircraft and hit the ground at terminal velocity? Or did they die from head trauma within the aircraft prior to that? Or did they die from a shock-induced heart attack, or stroke, or cardiac paralysis? You know, it's usually only in movies where people are screaming in such circumstances. The truth is, they were probably paralyzed by fear. Did their minds shut down upon the realization of their imminent deaths? Do you think even for a split second they thought there was any chance they would survive? Roger Peterson's body was entangled in the cockpit. The county coroner, Ralph Smiley, would later report that all 4 victims had died instantly, with the cause of death attributed to, quote, gross trauma to the brain, end quote, for the musicians, and, quote, brain damage, end quote, for the pilot. Here's what the coroner had to say about Buddy Holly. The body of Charles H. Holly was clothed in an outer jacket of yellow leather-like material in which 4 seams in the back were split almost full length. The skull was split medially, in the forehead, and this extended into the vortex region. Approximately half the brain tissue was absent. There was bleeding from both ears, and the face showed multiple lacerations. The consistency of the chest was soft due to extensive crushing injury to the bony structure. The left forearm was fractured 1/3 the way up from the wrist, and the right elbow was fractured. Both thighs and legs showed multiple fractures. Fingerprints were taken of the deceased for purposes of identification. Here's what the coroner had to say about Richie Valens. The body was clothed in a black wool cloth overcoat containing a label, quote, Harrison drank, Los Angeles, California, end quote. A black wool cloth suit containing inside the coat label, quote, Soel San Fernando, California, end quote. A white shirt and underclothing. On the volar surface of the right forearm was a dark tattoo of initials RV. The head was badly crushed and deformed. The calvarium region wide open, and the brain tissue almost completely eviscerated. The right side of the face was crushed and flattened, and the right eye socket eviscerated. The facial features were not identifiable. There was marked deformity of the left forearm due to a fracture, a 1-inch laceration on the dorsum of the left hand at its junction with the little finger. The left upper femur had marked deformity with fracture, while the right tibia showed a compound fracture. There were 2 shallow lacerations in the medial mid-left shin region. Internal injuries were not appraised because autopsy was not done. Fingerprints were taken of the deceased for purposes of identification. Here's what the coroner had to say about the Big Bopper. The body of Giles P. Richardson was clothed in a red check flannel shirt and light blue cotton pants. There was no jacket or overcoat on the body. In one hip pocket of his trousers was a billfold containing his name and other identifying information. The head was badly mangled and misshapen. The skull was split open, transversely, at the supraorbital ridge and at the vertex. The brain was almost completely eviscerated. The face was flattened and crushed on the right side and not identifiable. There were several deforming fractures of both arms. Across the middle phalanx of the second left finger was a laceration. On the right thigh, extensor surface was a laceration 8 inches long, while further down on the leg was a large defect including a compound fracture. The left upper medial thigh had a transverse laceration 8 inches long, while the left mid-tibial region showed a small laceration at the site of a compound fracture. The consistency of the chest was soft due to extensive crushing of the bony structure. Internal injuries were not appraised because autopsy was not done. Fingerprints were taken of the deceased for purposes of identification. And so that's what happened to their bodies. For the following 10 hours after the crash, the remains of all 4 individuals lay at the site. The harshness of the storm prevented anybody from knowing about the location until morning. Going back in time a little bit, by 1 a.m. in the morning, when the pilot Roger Peterson failed to establish the expected radio contact and repeated efforts to reach him via radio proved unsuccessful, Jerry Dwyer called the Fargo airport and other nearby airports and was told no Bonanza landed and that no planes would land due to the stormy weather. Jerry Dwyer continued to try to reach the pilot multiple times. Finally, after sunrise, Dwyer initiated an aerial search to locate the aircraft that had gone missing. He began by following the route taken by Peterson. At 9:35 a.m., he successfully located the wreckage in a farm field situated roughly 5 miles to the northwest of the airport. From the air, he saw the airplane had suffered extensive damage, and he knew that all 4 individuals on board had lost their lives. Because it snowed throughout the evening, the ground in the vicinity was covered by approximately 4 inches of snow. No fire had occurred, and all components were verified at present at the crash site. No indications of in-flight structural failure or control failure were found. The landing gear remained retracted at the time of impact. Examination of the damaged engine revealed no signs of malfunction or in-flight failure. Both propeller blades were fractured at the hub, suggesting the engine was generating power upon ground impact. Inspection of the hub's pitch change mechanisms indicated that the blade pitch fell within the cruise range. Mr. Anderson, who had driven the group to the airport and had witnessed the plane's takeoff, was notified and asked to come to the airport to identify the bodies of the musicians. Because each of their bodies was essentially like a bag of broken bones, they likely weren't picked up and put on gurneys. Instead, they likely put a body bag on the ground and pivoted each deceased musician in one direction and placed the body bag underneath, and then pivoted the body in the opposite direction while carefully pulling the body bag underneath. At that point, they would then zip up the body bag and carry the deceased away.
Historian from Clear Lake, Iowa, 3 of the nation's top rock and roll singing stars, Richie Valens, JP the Big Bopper Richardson, and Buddy Holly, died today with their pilot in the crash of a chartered plane, following an appearance before 1,000 fans.
Back in Lubbock, Texas, Buddy Holly's mother received an unexpected call from the former Cricket's guitarist Nicky Sullivan, inquiring about the validity of the rumors surrounding Buddy's demise. Moments later, a neighbor rushed into the Holly residence, urging Buddy Holly's mom to switch on the radio. It was through this tragic turn of events that Buddy Holly's mom found out that her son had died. In the months that followed this plane crash, authorities implemented a policy refraining from disclosing the identities of victims until their families had been informed. A couple of months following the accident, a nearby farmer discovered Buddy Holly's personal belongings, including the frames of his eyeglasses without the lenses, a watch band, a watch, and some dice. Funerals for the victims were held individually. Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper were buried in Texas. Richie Valens was buried in California, and the pilot was buried in Iowa. In March of 2007, at the behest of Jay Richardson, the son of J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, the decision was made to exhume his father's remains. Dr. Bill Bass, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee, conducted an examination in Beaumont, Texas. Notably, a firearm that once belonged to Buddy Holly had been discovered at the crash site, sparking speculations that the pilot might have been shot and that J.P. Richardson could have survived and sought help. In the words of Richardson's son, quote, "I was hoping to quell these rumors," end quote. Dr. Bass performed X-ray studies on the exhumed remains, yet no evidence was found to substantiate those theories. He confirmed that Richardson had, quote, "fractures from head to toe, massive fractures. He died immediately," end quote. Buddy Holly had achieved rock stardom for just a brief 18-month period before his passing at the age of 22. Following his death, Buddy Holly's albums continued to experience robust sales. His record label swiftly released a greatest hits compilation, which maintained a presence on the Billboard charts for an additional 7 years. Across the Atlantic, the British audience exhibited an insatiable appetite for Buddy Holly's music, even surpassing the record company's ability to produce enough. Demo tapes, B-sides, and previously unreleased recording sessions surged up the UK charts, solidifying Buddy Holly's status as one of the pioneers of the British invasion that would captivate America 5 years later. Notably, the Beatles honed their guitar skills in part by listening to Buddy Holly's records. Also, the first single released in the United States by the Rolling Stones was a cover of Buddy Holly's song Not Fade Away. And that, my fellow time travelers and strange historians, is the story of the final moments of Buddy Holly's life. So what do you think of Buddy Holly and how he died? What are your thoughts about what happened that night? What do you think was going on in the cabin right after the plane took off, and during the flight, and just prior to and during and following the crash? Kindly share your thoughts in the comments below. By the way, I don't know who took some of the photos I have shown in this show, so if you do, will you kindly let me know so I can respectfully give them the credit they deserve. At this point, I'd like to thank you for joining me in this time travel adventure. Kindly remember to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because there will be more videos like this one, and I hope you'll check those out too. Please check out the links below to learn how to support my research and productions. Specifically, I'd really appreciate it if you could become a member of my channel and or join me on Patreon. You could also leave a super thanks in the comments below. Kindly be kind to all non-human animals, and please don't eat them. They don't like that. Remember, for the benefit of compassion for all living things and their own health, all the Beatles chose a plant-based diet. And please do yourself a favor and go to a local shelter and adopt a cat or a dog. You and they will be very glad that you did. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.